Chapter 6. A Brace of Unwelcome Visitors of the Lost City. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lost City by Joseph E. Badger, Jr. Chapter 6. A Brace of Unwelcome Visitors. Instinctively, the brothers drew nearer each other, as though for mutual protection, each one letting hand drop to a belt where a revolver was habitually carried, but which was lacking now, thanks to the great haste with which they had taken wing at the approach of the tornado. "What is it? What can it mean?" asked Bruno and Waldo almost in the same breath, as those fierce echoes died away in the distance. Professor Featherwit made no immediate reply, but by the glow of yonder camp-fire he fumbled inside the magic locker, fetching forth firearms, then speaking in hushed tones. "Wait. Listen for I know it." From the opposite quarter came what might easily have been an echo of that first wild screech, only louder, longer, more savage, if such a thing be possible. Prepared though they now were, neither brother could refrain from shrinking and shuddering, so hideously that cry sounded in their ears. But their uncle spoke in cool, clear tones. "There is nothing supernatural about that, my lads. A panther or mountain lion, I dare say, scenting the fumes of our cookery, and coming to claim a share." "Then it isn't nothing spookish, uncle Phaeton?" ventured Waldo, in slightly unsteady tones. The professor gave swift assurance upon that point, and, rallying as few youngsters would have done under like circumstances, the brothers grasped the weapons, supplied their hands, waiting and watching for what was to come. Once, twice, thrice, those savage calls echoed far and wide, but with each repetition losing a portion of their terrors, and knowing now that prowling beasts surely were drawing nigh the camp-fire, the flying machine was abandoned by the trio, all drawing closer to the fire, which might prove no slight protection against attack. Then followed a period of utter silence, during which their eyes roved restlessly around, striving to sight the four-footed enemy ere an actual attack could be made. Professor Featherwit was first to glimpse a pair of greenish eyes in silent motion, and giving a low hiss of warning to his nephews, that same sound serving to check further progress on the part of the wild beast, his short rifle came to a level, then emitted a peculiar sound. Only the keenest of ears could have noted that, for only the fraction of an instant later followed a sharp explosion, the darkness beyond being briefly lit up by a yellowish glare. "That's enough! Beware its mate!" cried the professor, keenly alert for whatever might ensue, but the words were barely across his lips when, with a vicious snarl, a furry shape came flying through the air, knocking Featherwit over as he instinctively ducked his head, with arm flying up as additional guard. Both man and beast came very near falling into the fire itself, and there ensued a wild, confused scramble, out of which the brothers singled their enemy, Waldo opening fire with a revolver at close range, each shot causing the lion to yell and snarl most ferociously. A cat-like recovery, then the fatal leap might have followed, for the confused professor was rising to his feet again, fairly in front of the enraged brute, but ere worse came, Waldo and Bruno were to the rescue, one firing as rapidly as possible, his brother driving a keen-bladed knife to the very hilt, just back of that quivering forearm. One mad wrestle, in which both lads were overthrown, then the gaunt and muscular brute stretched its length in a shivering throe, dead even while it strove to slay. just as the professor hurried to the front, beseeching his boys to keep out of peril if they loved him, at which Waldo laughed outright, although never had he felt a warmer love for the same odd-speaking, queer-acting personage than right at that moment. "I'm all right. How's it with you, sir? And Bruno?" "Without a scratch to remember it by," promptly asserted the elder brother, likewise regaining his feet and taking hasty account of stock. "No fault of his, though," giving that carcass a kick as he spoke. "My gracious! I caught just one glimpse of them, and I was ready to make affidavit that each fang would measure a foot, while his claws would pass through an elephant and clinch on the other side," declared Waldo, stooping far enough to lift one of those armed paws. "But I say, Bruno, how awfully they have shrunk since then!" Whether so intended or not, this characteristic break caused a mutual laugh, and, as there was neither sound nor sign of further danger from like source, one and all satisfied their curiosity by minutely inspecting the huge brute, stirring up the fire for that purpose. "An ugly customer, indeed, if we had given him anything like a fair show," gravely uttered the professor. "Only for your prompt assistance, my dear boys, what would have become of poor me?" "We acted on our own account as well, please remember, uncle. And even so, after all you have done for us since—" "What was it you shot at, uncle Phaeton?" interrupted Waldo, who was constitutionally averse to aught which savoured of sentiment. "Another one of these little squirrels, was it?" Snatching up a blazing brand, the lad moved off in that direction, whirling the torch around his head until it burst into clear flame, then lowering it closer to a bloody heap of fur and powerful limbs, to give a short ejaculation of wondering awe. It was a headless body upon which he gazed, ragged fragments of skin and a few splinters of bone alone remaining to tell that a solid skull had so recently been thereon. Professor Phaeton gave another of his peculiar little chuckles as he drew near, then patted the compact little rifle with which he had wrought such extraordinary work, a weapon of his own invention, as were the dynamite-filled shells to match. "Although I am rather puny myself, boys, with this neat little contrivance I could fairly well hold my own against man or beast," he modestly averred. "A modern David," gravely added Bruno, while Waldo chimed in with, "What a dandy Jack the Giant Killer you would have been, uncle Phaeton, if you had only lived in the good old days! I wish. And yet I don't either. Of course, it might have been jolly old sport right then, but now, where'd I be today?" "A day on which has happened a miracle far more marvellous than all that has been set down in fairyland romance, my dear son," earnestly spoke the professor. "And when the astounding truth shall have been published broadcast throughout all Christendom, what praises! How thoroughly we shall be branded liars and falsificationers from way up the crick!" exploded the youngster, making a wry grimace, and moving on to view the headless lion from a different standpoint. "He means well, uncle Phaeton," assured Bruno, in lowered tones. "He would not knowingly hurt your feelings, sir, but may I speak out?" "Why not?" quickly. "Surely I am not one to stand in awe of lad?" "One to be loved and reverenced, rather," with poorly hidden emotion, then rallying, to add, "but when one finds it impossible to realize all that has happened this afternoon, when one feels afraid to even make an effort at such belief, how can the boy be blamed for feeling that all others would pronounce us mad or wilful liars?" Professor Phaeton saw the point, and made a wry grimace, while ruffing up his pompadour and brushing his closely trimmed beard with doubtful hand. After all, was the whole truth to be ever spoken? "Well, well, we can determine more clearly after fully weighing the subject," he said, turning back towards the flying machine. "And after all, what has happened to us thus far may not seem so utterly incredible after our explorations are completed." "Of this region, do you mean, sir?" "Of the Olympic Mountains, and all their mountainous chain may encompass, yes," curtly spoke the man of hopes, stepping inside the aerostat to perfect his arrangements for the night. Waldo took greater pleasure in viewing the mountain lion towards whose destruction he had so liberally contributed, but when he spoke of removing the skin, Bruno objected. "Why take so much trouble for nothing, Waldo? Even if we could stow the pelts away on board, they would make a far from agreeable burden. And if what I fancy lies before us is to come true, the more lightly we are weighted, the more likely we are to come safely to, well, call it civilization, just for a change." "Then you believe that uncle Phaeton is really in earnest about exploring this region, Bruno?" "He most assuredly is. Did you ever know him to speak idly, or to be otherwise than in earnest, Waldo?" "Well, of course uncle is all right, but sometimes—" A friendly palm slipped over those lips, cutting short the speech which might perchance have left a sting behind. And yet the worthy professor had no more enthusiastic acolyte than this same reckless-speaking youngster when the truth was all told. Leaving the animals where they had fallen for the time being, the brothers passed over to where rested the aeromotor, finding the professor busily engaged in rigging up a series of fine wires, completely surrounding the flying machine, save for one narrow, gate-like arrangement. "Beginning to feel as though you could turn in for all night, eh, my boys?" came his cheery greeting. "Well, somehow I do feel as though the Sandman had been making his rounds rather earlier than customary," dryly said Waldo, winking rapidly. "I believe there must have been a bit more wind astir today than common, although neither of you may have noticed the fact." Professor Featherwit chuckled softly while at work, but neither he nor Bruno made reply in words. And then, his arrangements perfected save for closing the circuit, which could only be done after all hands had entered the air ship, he spoke to the point. "Come, boys, you've had a rough bit of experience this day, and there may be still further trouble in store, here in this unknown land. Better make sure of a full night's rest, and thus have a reserve fund to draw upon in case of need." There was plenty of sound common sense in this adjuration, and only taking time to procure a can of fresh water from yonder stream, the two youngsters stepped within that charmed circle, permitting their uncle to close the circuit, and then test the queer contrivance to make sure all was working nicely. A confused sound broke forth, resembling the far-away tooting of tin horns, which blended inharmoniously with the ringing of nearer bells, all producing a noise which was warranted to arouse the heaviest sleeper from his soundest slumber. "That will give fair warning in case any intruder drifts this way," declared the professor, chucklingly, then sinking down and wrapping himself up in a close-woven blanket similar to those employed by the boys. "Even a ghost or a goblin, do you reckon, uncle Phaeton?" "Should such attempts to intrude, yes. Go to sleep, you young rascal." But that proved to be far more readily spoken than lived up to. Not but that the brothers were weary, jaded, and sore of muscle enough to make even the thought of slumber agreeable, but their recent experience had been so thrilling, so nerve-straining, so far apart from the ordinary routine of life, that hours passed ere either lad could fairly lose himself in sleep. Still, when unconsciousness did steal over their weary brains, it proved to be all the more complete, and after that neither Bruno nor Waldo stirred hand or foot until, well after the dawn of a new day, Professor Featherwit shook first one and then the other, crying shrilly, "Turn out, youngsters! A new day and plenty of work to be done!" End of chapter 6. Chapter 7. The Professor's Great Anticipations of the Lost City. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lost City by Joseph E. Badger, Jr. Chapter 7. The Professor's Great Anticipations. A stretch and a yawn. which in Waldo's case ended in a prolonged howl, which would not have disgraced either of their four-footed visitors of the past evening. Then the brothers Gillespie sprung forth from the flying machine, entering upon a race for the brawling mountain stream, shedding their garments as they ran. "First man in!" cried Bruno, whose clothes seemed to slip off the more readily, but Waldo was not to be outdone so easily, and reckless of the consequences, he plunged into the eddying pool with fully half of his daylight rig still in place. The water proved to be considerably deeper than either brother had anticipated, and Waldo vanished from sight for a few seconds, then reappearing with lusty puff and splutter, shaking the pearly drops from his close-clipped curls while ranting: "Another vile fabrication nailed to the standard of truth and clinched by the hammer of ouch!" A wild flounder, then the youngster fairly doubled himself up, acting so strangely that Bruno gave a little cry of alarm, but ere the elder brother could take further action, Waldo swung his right arm upward and outward, sending a goodly-sized trout flashing through the air to the shore, crying in boyish enthusiasm: "Glory in great chunks! I want to camp right here for a year to come. Will you look at that, now?" Bruno had to dodge that writhing missile, and before he could fairly recover himself, Waldo had floundered ashore, leaving a yeasty turmoil in his wake, but then throwing up a dripping hand and speaking in an exaggerated whisper: "St, boy! On your life, not so much as a ghost of a whimper. The hole's ram-jammed chuck-full of trout, and we'll have a meal fit for the gods if— Where's my fishing tackle?" Bruno picked up the trout, so queerly brought to light, really surprised, but feigning still further, as he made his examination. "It really is a trout, and how long have you carried this about in your clothes, Waldo Gillespie?" "Not long enough for you to build a decent joke over it, brother mine. Just happened so. Tried to ram its nose in one of my pockets, and of course I had to take him in out of the wet. Pool's just full of them, too, and I wouldn't wonder if— Oh, quit your talking and do something, can't you, boy?" Vigorously though he spoke, Waldo wound up with a shiver and sharp chatter of teeth as the fresh morning air struck through his dripping garments. He gave a coltish prance as he turned to seek his fishing tackle, but, unfortunately for his hopes of speedy sport, the professor was nigh enough to both see and hear, and at once took charge of the reckless youngster. "Wet to the hide, and upon an empty stomach, too, you foolish child! Come, strip to the buff and put on some of these garments until— Here, by the fire, Waldo!" And thus taken in tow, the lad was forced to slowly but thoroughly toast his person beside the freshly started fire, ruefully watching his brother deftly handle rod and line in a remarkably short space of time, killing trout enough to furnish all with a bounteous meal. "And I was the discoverer, while you reap all the credit, have all the fun!" dolefully lamented Waldo, when the catch was displayed with an ostentation which may have covered just a tiny bit of malice. "I'll put a tin ear on you, Amerigo Vespucius!" "All right, we'll have a merry go together after you've cleaned the trout for cooking, lad," laughed his elder. Waldo gazed reproachfully into that bright face for a brief space, then bowed head in joined hands, to sob in heartfelt fashion, his sturdy frame shaking with poorly suppressed grief or mirth. Bruno passed an arm caressingly over those shoulders, murmuring words of comfort, earnestly promising to never sin again in like manner, provided he could find forgiveness now. And then, with deft touch, that same hand held his garment far enough for its mate to let slip a wriggling trout down his brother's back. Waldo howled and jumped wildly as the cold morsel slipped along his spine, and ducking out of reach, the elder jester called back: "Land him, boy, and you've caught another fish." Although laughing heartily himself, Professor Featherwit deemed it a part of wisdom to interfere now, and ere long matters quieted down, all hands engaged in preparing the morning meal, for which all teeth were now fairly on edge. If good nature had been at all disturbed, long before that breakfast was dispatched it was fully restored, and of the trio Waldo appeared to be the most enthusiastic over present prospects. "Why, just think of it, will you?" he declaimed, as well as might be, with mouthful of crisply fried mountain trout. "Where the game comes begging for you to bowl it over, and the very fish try to jump into your pockets." "Or down your back, Amerigo," interjected Bruno, with a grin. "Button up, or you'll turn to be a sorry customer, old man," came the swift retort, with a portentous frown. "But, joking aside, why not? With such hunting and fishing, I'd be willing to sign a contract for a round year in this region." "To say nothing of exploration and such discoveries as naturally attend upon." "Then you really mean it all, uncle Phaeton?" Leaning back far enough to pluck a handful of green leaves, which fairly well served the purpose of a napkin, Professor Featherwit brought forth pipe and pouch, maintaining a silence until the fragrant tobacco was well alight. Then he gave a vigorous nod of his head to utter: "It has been the dearest dream of my life for more years gone by than you would readily credit, my lads, or, in fact, than I would be wholly willing to confess. And it was with an eye single to this very adventure that I laboured to devise and perfect yonder machine." "A marvel in itself, uncle Phaeton. Only for that, where would we have been yesterday?" seriously spoke the elder Gillespie. "I know where we wouldn't have been. Inside that blessed nado." "Nor here, where you can catch brook trout in your clothes without the trouble of taking them off, youngster." "And where you'll catch a precious hiding without you let up harping on that old string. It's way out of tune already, old man." "Tit for tat. Excuse us, please, uncle Phaeton. We're like colts in fresh pasture this morning," brightly apologized Bruno for both. Apparently the professor paid no attention to that bit of sparring between his nephews, staring into the glowing camp fire with eyes which surely saw more than yellow coals or ruddy flames could picture, eyes which burned and sparkled with all the fires of distant youth. "The dearest dream of all my life," he repeated in half dreamy tones, only to rouse himself with a start and shoulder shake an instant later, forcing a bright smile as he glanced from face to face. "And why not? How better could my last years be employed than in piercing the clouds of mystery and doubt and superstition with which this vast tract has been enveloped for uncounted ages?" "Is it really so unknown then, uncle Phaeton?" hesitatingly asked Bruno, touched, in spite of himself, by that intensely earnest tone and expression. "Of course, I know what the Indians say. They are full of a rude sort of superstitious awe, which is one of the surest proofs that truth forms a foundation for that very superstition," quickly interjected the professor. "It is an undisputed fact that there are hundreds upon hundreds of square miles of terra incognita lying in this corner of Washington Territory. No white man ever fairly penetrated these wilds, even so far as we may have been carried while riding the tornado. Or if so, he assuredly has never returned or made known his discoveries." "Provided there was anything beyond the ordinary to see or experience, shouldn't we add, uncle?" suggested Waldo, modestly. "There is, there must be. No matter how wildly improbable their traditions may seem in our judgment, it only takes calm investigation to bring a fair foundation to light. In regard to this vast scope of country, go where you will among the natives, question whom you see fit as to its secrets, and you will meet with the same results. A deep-seated awe, a belief which cannot be shaken, that here strange monsters breed and flourish, matched in magnitude and power by an armed race of human beings, before whose awful might other tribes are but as ants in the pathway of an elephant." Waldo let escape a low, prolonged whistle of mingled wonder and credulity, but Bruno gave him a covert kick, himself too deeply interested to bear with a careless interruption just then. "Of course, there may be something of exaggeration in all this," admitted the enthusiastic professor. "Undoubtedly there is at least a fair spice of that, but even so, enough remains to both waken and hold our keenest interest. Listen and take heed, my good lads. You have often enough, of late days, noticed these mountains, and if you remark their altitude, the vast scope of country they dominate, the position they fill, you must likewise realize one other fact, that an immense quantity of snow in winter, rain in spring and autumn, surely must fall throughout the Olympics. Understand?" "Certainly. Why not, uncle Phaeton?" "Then tell me this. Where does all the moisture go to? What becomes of the surplus waters? For it is an acknowledged fact that, though rivers and brooks surely exist in the Olympics, not one of either flows away from this wide tract of country." The professor paused for a minute to let his words take full effect, then even more positively proceeded. "You may say, what I have had others offer by way of solution, that all is drained into a mighty inland sea or enormous lake. Granting so much, which I really believe to be the truth as far as it goes, why does that lake never overflow? Of all that surely must drain into its basin, be that enormously wide and deep as it may, how much could ordinary evaporation dispose of? Only an infinitesimal portion, scarcely worth mentioning in such connection. Then, what becomes of the surplusage?" Another pause, during which neither Gillespie ventured a solution. Then the professor offered his own suggestion. "It must flow off in some manner, and what other manner can that be than through a subterranean connection with the Pacific Ocean?" Bruno gave a short ejaculation at this, while Waldo broke forth in words after his own particular fashion. "Jules Verne rendezvous! Why can't we take a trip through the centre of the earth, or any other little old thing like that?" "With a tank of compressed air as a life preserver?" laughed Bruno in turn. "That might serve, but unfortunately we have only the one, and we are three in number, boy." "Only two, now I'm squelched," sighed the jester faintly. If the professor heard, he heeded not. Still staring with vacant gaze into the fire, his face bearing a rapt expression curious to see, he broke into almost unconscious speech. "An enormous inland sea, where float the mighty ichthyosaurus, the megalosaurus, in company with the gigantic plesiosaurus, upon whose sloping shores disport the enormous mastodon, the stately megatherium, the tremendous, eh?" For Waldo was now afoot, brandishing a great branch broken from a dead tree, uttering valiant war whoops, and dealing tremendous blows upon an imaginary enemy, spouting at the top of his voice a frenzied jargon which neither his auditors nor himself could possibly make sense out of. Bruno, ever sensitive through his affectionate reverence for their uncle, caught the youngster and cast him to earth, whereupon Waldo pantingly cried, "Go on, please, uncle Phaeton. It's next to a museum and menagerie combined, just to hear—" "Will you hush, boy?" demanded Bruno, yet unable to wholly smother a laugh, so ridiculous did it all sound and seem. But Professor Featherwit declined, his foxy face wrinkling in a bashful laugh. Whether so intended or not, he had been brought down to earth from that dizzy flight, and now was fairly himself again. "Well, my dear boys, I dare say it seems all a matter of jest and sport to you, yet after our riding in the centre of a tornado for uncounted miles, coming forth with hardly a scratch or a bruise to show for it all, who dare say such things may not be, even yet?" "But those strange creatures are gone. The last one perished thousands upon thousands of years ago, uncle Phaeton." "So it is said, and so follows the almost universal belief. Yet I have seen, felt, cooked, tasted, and ate to its last morsel a steak from a mammoth. True, the creature was dead, had been preserved for ages, no doubt, within the glacier which finally cast it forth to human view. Yet who would have credited such a discovery only 50 years ago? He who dared to even hint at such a thing would have been derided and laughed at, pronounced either fool or lunatic. And so, if we should happen to discover one or all of those supposedly extinct creatures here in this terra incognita, I would be overjoyed rather than astounded." Bruno looked grave at this conclusion, but Waldo was not so readily impressed, and, with shrugging shoulders, he made answer: "Well, uncle, I'm not quite so ambitious as all that comes to. May I give you my idea of it all? End of chapter 7. '8. A Duel to the Death of the Lost City. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lost City by Joseph E. Badger, Jr. Chapter 8. A Duel to the Death. Professor Featherwit nodded assent, and after a brief chuckle, Waldo resumed. "You can take all those big fellows with the jaw-breaking names, but as for me, smaller game will do. Maybe a fellow couldn't fill his bag quite so full, nor quite so suddenly, but there would be a great deal more sport, and a mighty sight less danger, I take it." It was by no means difficult to divine that the professor had not yet spoken all that busied his brain, but the thread was broken, his pipe was out, and emptying the ashes by tapping pipe bowl against the heel of his shoe, he rose erect, once more the man of action. "You will have to clear up, lads, for I must make such few repairs as are necessary to restore the aerostat to a state of efficiency. So long as that remains in serviceable condition, we will always have a method of advance or retreat. Without it, well, I'd rather not think of the alternative." That dry tone and quiet sentence did more than all else to impress the brothers with a sense of their unique position. Back came the remembrance of all they had gathered concerning this strange scope of country since first settling down fairly within the shadows of the Olympics, there to put that strange machine together, preparing for what was to prove a wonder tour through many marvellous happenings. Times beyond counting they had been assured by the natives that no mortal could fairly penetrate that vast wilderness. Natural obstacles were too great for any man to surmount, without saying aught of what lay beyond, of the enormous animals such as the civilized world never knew or fought with, of the terrible natives, taller than the pines, larger than the hills, more powerful by far than the gods themselves, eager to slay and to devour, so eager that, at times, living flesh and blood was more grateful than all to their depraved tastes. "Do you really reckon there's anything in it at all, Bruno?" asked the younger brother, in lower tones, glancing across to where their uncle was busily engaged in those comparatively trifling repairs. "It hardly seems possible, and yet, would the members of 4 different tribes tell a story so nearly alike, without they had at least a foundation of truth to go upon?" "That's right, and yet the inland sea sounds natural enough. We know, too, that there are such things as underground rivers, outside of Jules Verne's yarns. But those animals, or reptiles, which?" "Both, I believe," answered Bruno, with a subdued laugh. "That's all right, old man. I never was worth a continental when it came to such things. I prefer to live in the present, and so well now, will you just look at that old cow!" In surprise, Waldo pointed across to where a bovine shape showed not far beyond the pool at the base of the miniature waterfall, but his brother had a fairer view, and, instantly divining the truth, grasped an arm and hastily whispered, "Hush, boy, can't you see? It's a buffalo, a hill buffalo, and—" "Quick, the guns are in the machine! Down, Bruno, and maybe we can get a shot and—" His eager whisper was cut short, though not by a grip of arm or act by his brother. A rumbling roar broke forth from the further side of that mountain stream, and as the dense bushes beyond were violently agitated, the hill buffalo wheeled that way with marvellous rapidity. Just as a long head and mighty shoulders spread the shrubbery wide apart, jaws opening and lips curling back to lay great teeth bare, while another angry sound, half growl, half snort, only too clearly proclaimed that monster of the mountains, a grizzly bear. "Smoke a sacrifice!" gasped Waldo, as the grizzly suddenly upreared its mighty bulk, head wagging, paws waving in queer fashion, lolling tongue lending the semblance of drollery rather than viciousness. "This way! To your guns, boys!" cautiously called out the professor, whose notice had likewise been caught by those unusual sounds, and who had already armed himself with his pet dynamite gun. "Careful! He'll make a break for us at first sight, unless down close and crawl for it, brother!" Bruno set the good example, and Waldo was not too proud of spirit to humble himself in like manner. Although this was their first glimpse of old F in his native wilds, both brothers entertained a very respectful opinion of his prowess. Under different circumstances their expectations might have been more fully met, but just now the grizzly seemed wholly occupied with the buffalo bull, whose sturdy bulk and armed front so resolutely opposed his further progress towards that common goal, the pool of water. The boys quickly reached the flying machine and gripped the Winchester rifles which Professor Featherwit had drawn forth from the locker at first sight of the dangerous game. Thus armed, they felt ready for whatever might come, and stood watching yonder rivals with growing interest. "Will you look at that, now?" excitedly breathed Waldo, eyes aglow as he saw the bull cock its tail on high and tear up the soft soil with one fierce sweep of its cloven hoof, shaking head and giving vent to a low but determined bellow. "It means a fight unto the death, I think," whispered the professor. "It's dollars to doughnuts on the bear," predicted Waldo. "Scat, you bull-headed idiot! Don't you know that you're not deuce high to his ace? Can't you see that he can chew you up like—" "Are you mighty sure of all that, boy?" laughingly cut in Bruno, for at that moment the buffalo made a sudden charge at his upright adversary, knocking the grizzly backward in spite of its viciously flying paws. "Great Peter on a bender! If I ever— No, I never!" Even the professor was growing excited, holding the dynamite gun under one arm while gently tapping palms together as an encore. Naturally enough, their sympathies were with the buffalo, since the odds seemed so immensely against him, but their delight was short-lived, for, instead of following up the advantage so bravely won, the bull fell back to paw and bellow and shake his shaggy front. With marvellous activity for a brute of his enormous bulk and weight, the grizzly recovered its feet, then lumbered forward with clashing teeth and resounding growls. Nothing loath, the buffalo met that charge, and for a short space of time the struggle was veiled by showers of leaf mould and damp dirt cast upon the air as the rivals fought for supremacy and for life. For that this was destined to be a duel to the very death not one of those spectators could really doubt. That encounter may have been purely accidental, but the creatures fought like enemies of long standing. As their relative positions changed, the buffalo contrived to get in another vigorous butt, sending Bruin end for end down that gentle slope to souse into the pool of water, that cool element cutting short a savage roar of mad fury. Then the trio of spectators could take notes, and with something of sorrow they saw that the buffalo had already suffered severely, bleeding from numerous great gashes torn by the grizzly's long talons, while one bloody eye dangled below its socket, held only by a thread of sinew. Nor had Bruin escaped without hurt, as all could see when he floundered out of the water, bent upon renewing the duel, but there was little room left for doubting what the ultimate result would be were the animals left to their own devices. Like all bold, free-hearted lads, Waldo ever sympathized with the weaker, and now, unable to hold his feelings in check, he gave a short cry, levelling his Winchester and opening fire upon the grizzly, just as it won fairly clear of the water. Stung to fury by those pellets, the brute reared up with a horrid roar, turning as though to charge this new enemy, but ere he could do more, the professor's gun spoke, and as the dynamite shell exploded, Bruin fell back a writhing mass, his head literally smashed to pieces. Heedless of all else, the wounded buffalo charged with lusty bellow, goring that quivering mass with unabated fury, though its life was clearly leaking out through those ghastly cuts and slashes. A brief pause, then Professor Featherwit swiftly reloaded his gun, sending another shell across the stream, this time more as a boon than as punishment. Smitten fairly in the forehead, the bull dropped as though beneath a bolt of lightning, life going out without so much as a single struggle or a single pang. "'Twas better thus," declared the professor, as Waldo gave a little ejaculation of dismay. He must have bled to death in a short time, and this was true mercy. Besides, buffalo meat is very good eating, and the day may come when we shall need all we can get. Who knows? After the animals were inspected, and due comment made upon the awfully sure work wrought by the dynamite gun, the professor suggested that, while he was completing repairs upon the aeromotor, the brothers should secure a supply of fish and of flesh, cooking sufficient to provide for several meals, for there was no telling just when they would have an equal chance. "Just as soon as we can put all in readiness," he continued, "I am going to leave this spot. My first wish is to thoroughly test the aerostat, to make certain it has received no serious injury. Then, if all promises well, I mean to begin our tour of exploration, hoping that we may, at least, find something well worthy the strange reputation given these Olympics by the natives." Without raising any objections, the brothers fell to work, Bruno looking after the flesh, while Waldo undertook to supply the fish. That was but fair, since he had been cheated out of catching the first mess. Not a little to his delight, the professor found that the flying machine would promptly answer his touch and will, rising easily off the ground, then descending at call, evidently having passed through the ordeal of the bygone evening without serious harm. Still, all this consumed time, and it was after a late dinner that everything was pronounced in readiness for an ascension. The meat and fish nicely cooked and packed for carriage, a pot of strong coffee made and stowed beyond a risk of leakage, the flying machine itself quivering in that gentle breeze, as though eager to find itself once more afloat far above the earth and its obstructions to easy navigation. Waldo expressed some grief at leaving a spot where game came in such plenitude to find the hunter, and trout simply longed to be caught, but upon being assured of other opportunities, perhaps even more delightful, he sighed and gave consent to mount into space. "Only don't ask me to tackle any of those long big dictionary fellows such as you talked about this morning, Uncle Phaeton, for I simply can't. They'd get away with my baggage while I was trying to spell their names and title and all that." Without any difficulty the aeromotor was sent out of and above the forest, heading towards the northwest, that is, direct for the heart of the Olympics, of whose marvels Professor Featherwit held such exalted hopes and expectations. Grim and forbidding those mountains looked as the airship sailed swiftly over them, opening up a wider view when the bare, rugged crest was once left fairly to the rear. Save for those bald crowns, all below appeared a solid carpet of tree-tops. Now lower, there higher, yet ever the same, seemingly impenetrable to man should such an effort be made. Once fairly within the charmed circle, leaving the rocky ridge behind, Professor Featherwit slackened speed, permitting the ship to drift onward at a moderate pace, one hand touching the steering gear while its fellow held a pair of field glasses to his eager eyes. All at once he gave a half-stifled cry, partly rising in his excitement, then crying aloud in thrilling tones: "The sea! An inland sea!" End of chapter 8. Chapter 9. Grappling a Queer Fish of the Lost City. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lost City by Joseph E. Badger, Jr. Chapter 9. Grappling a Queer Fish. At nearly the same moment, both Bruno and Waldo caught a glimpse of water, shining clear and distinct amidst that sombre setting. but as yet a tree-crested elevation interfered with the prospect, and it was not until after the course of the airship had been materially changed, and some little time had elapsed, that aught definite could be determined as to the actual spread of that body of water. This proved to be considerable, although it needed but a single look into the professor's face to learn that his eager hopes and exalted anticipations fell far short of realization. "Well, it's a sea all right," generously declared Waldo, giving a vigorous sniff by way of strengthening his words. "I can smell the salt clear from this. A sea, even if it isn't quite so large as others. What one might term a lower case sea." If nothing else, that generous effort brought its reward in the dry little chuckle which escaped the professor's lips, and a kindly glow showed through his glasses as he turned towards Waldo with a nod of acknowledgment. "Barring the salty scent, my dear boy, which probably finds birth in your kindly imagination. So, on the whole, perhaps 'twould be just as well to term it a lake. One of no mean dimensions, at any rate, uncle Phaeton." "True, Bruno," with a nod of agreement, yet with forehead contracting into a network of troubled lines. "Naturally so. And yet, surely this must be merely a portion, unless yet I fail to see aught which might be interpreted as being—" Promptly responding to each touch of hand upon steering gear, the aeromotor swung smoothly around, sailing on even keel right into the teeth of the gentle wind, by this time near enough to that body of water for the air voyagers to scan its surface, a considerable expanse all told, yet by no means of such magnitude as Professor Featherwit had anticipated. Too deeply absorbed in his own thoughts to notice the little cries and ejaculations which came from the brothers, he caused the aerostat to rise higher, slowly sweeping that extended field with his glasses. He could see where several streams entered the body of water, coming from opposite points of the compass, and thus confirming at least one portion of his explained theory, but, so far as his visual powers went, there was no other considerable body of water to be discovered. Yet, how can that contracted basin contain all the drainage from this vast scope of country? How can we explain the stubborn fact of— What now, lads? An abrupt break, but one caused by the eager cry and loud speech from the lips of the younger Gillespie. "Look ye yonder! Isn't that one of those Sourous dictionary fellows on a bender? Isn't that— But I don't know. It's only a partly decayed tree gone afloat," volunteered Bruno, with a merry laugh as his eager brother drew back in evident chagrin. "Well, that's all right. It ought to have been one, even if it isn't. What's the use in coming all this way if we're not going to discover something beyond the common? And my sour-us is worth more than one of the other kind, after all. Get it ashore, and you might cook dinner for a solid month by it. Now there!" It was easily to be seen that Waldo had been giving free rein to his expectations ever since the professor's little lecture, but his natural chagrin was quickly forgotten in a matter of far greater interest. Professor Featherwit had resumed his scrutiny of yonder body of water, slowly turning his glasses while holding the airship on a true course and even keel. For a brief space nothing interfered with the steady motion of the field glasses, but then something called for a more thorough examination, and little by little the savant leaned farther forward, breath coming more rapidly, face beginning to flush with deepening interest. Bruno took note of all this, and, failing to see aught to account for the symptoms with unaided eyes, at length ventured to speak. "What is it, uncle Phaeton? Something of interest, or your looks—" Professor Featherwit gave a start, then lowered the glasses and reached them towards his nephew, speaking hurriedly. "You try them, Bruno. Your eyes are younger, and ought to be keener than mine. Yonder, towards the lower end of the lake, please." Nothing loath, Gillespie complied, quickly finding the correct point upon which the professor's interest had centred, holding the glasses motionless for a brief space, then giving vent to an eager ejaculation. "What is it all about, bless you, boy?" demanded Waldo, unable longer to curb his hot impatience.
Another drifting tree, eh?" "No, but did you see it, uncle?" "I saw something which what do you see first?" "A great, big a monster whirlpool which is hollowed like I knew it! I felt that must be the true solution of it all!" cried uncle Phaeton, squirming about pretty much as one might into whose veins had been injected quicksilver in place of ordinary blood. "The outlet, where the surplus waters drain off to the Pacific Ocean!" "I say, give me a chance, can't you?" interrupted Waldo, grasping the glasses and shifting his station for one more favourable as a outlook. He had been sufficient to catch the right angle, and then gave a suppressed snort as he took in the view. Half a minute thus, then a wild cry escaped his lips, closely followed by the words: "Now I do see something, and it isn't a drifting tree, either, or, that is, something else which shove her closer, uncle Phaeton. True as you live, there's something caught in yonder big suck, which is closer for love of glory." "If this is another joke, Waldo." "No, no, I tell you, Bruno. Shove her over, uncle, for without this glass is hoodooed. We're needed right yonder, and needed mighty bad, too." Little need of so much urging, by the way, since Professor Featherwit was but slightly less excited by their double discovery, and even before the glasses were clapped to Waldo's eyes, the aerostat swung around to move at full speed towards that precise quarter of the compass. "What is it you see, then, boy?" demanded Bruno, itching to take the glasses, yet straining his own vision towards that as yet far distant spot. "Something like oh, see how the water is running out, just like emptying a bathtub through a hole at the bottom. And see what? A man caught in the whirl! True's you're a foot high, uncle." "A man? Here? Impossible! Incredible, boy!" fairly exploded the professor, not yet ready to relinquish his cherished belief in a terra incognita. The air voyagers were swiftly nearing that point of interest, and now keen-eyed Bruno caught a glimpse of a drifting object which had been drawn within the influence of yonder whirlpool, but which was just as certainly a derelict from the forest. "Another floating tree trunk for Waldo!" he cried, with a short laugh, feeling far from unpleased that the intense strain upon his nerves should be thus lessened. "Try it again, lad, and perhaps—" "Try your great-grandmother's cotton nightcap! Don't you suppose I can tell the difference between a tree and a—" "Ranting, prancing, cavorting sour us right out of Webster's Unabridged, eh, laddie buck?" "That's all right, if you can only keep on thinking that way, old man. But if yonder isn't a fellow being in a mighty nasty pickle, then I wouldn't even begin to say so. You look, uncle Phaeton, please." Nothing loath, the professor took the proffered glasses, and but an instant later he too gave a sharp cry of amazement, for he saw, clinging to the trunk of a floating tree, swiftly moving with those circling waters, a living being. And but a few seconds later Bruno made the same discovery, greatly to the delight of his younger brother. "A man, and living too!" "Of course, reckon I'd make such a howl about a floater," bluntly interjected Waldo. "But I'll do my crowing later on. For now we've got to get the poor fellow out of that. You just got to yank him out." Through all this hasty interchange of words, the aeromotor was swiftly progressing, and now swung almost directly above the whirlpool, giving all a fair, unobstructed view of everything below. The suction was so great that a sloping basin was formed, more than 100 yards in diameter, while the actual centre lay a number of feet lower than the surrounding level. Halfway down that perilous slope a great tree was revolving, and to this, as his forlorn hope, clung a half-clad man, plainly alive, since he was looking upward, and yes, waving a hand and uttering a cry for aid and succour. "Help! For love of God, save me!" "White! An American, too!" exploded Waldo, taking action as by brilliant inspiration. "Hang over him, uncle, for I'm going to go fishing for a man." Waldo was tugging at the grapnel and long drag rope. Bruno was quick to divine his intention, and lent a deft hand, while the professor manipulated the helm so adroitly as to keep the flying machine hovering directly above yonder imperilled stranger, leaning far over the handrail to shout downward. "Have courage, sir, and stand ready to help yourself. We will rescue you if it lies within the possibilities of. We will save you." "You bet we just will, and right like this!" spluttered Waldo, as he cast the grapnel over the rail and swiftly lowered it by the rope. "Play you're a fish, stranger, and when you bite, hang on like grim death to a. Steady now!" Fortunately, nothing occurred to mar the programme so hastily arranged, for the drift was drawing nearer the centre of the whirl, and if once fairly caught by that, nothing human could preserve the stranger from death. "Make a jump and grab it if you can't do better!" cried Waldo, intensely excited now that the crisis was at hand. The long rope with its iron weight swayed awkwardly in spite of all he could do to steady it, and as each one of the three prongs was meant for catching and holding fast to whatever they touched, there was no slight risk of impaling the man, thus giving him the choice of another and still more painful death. Then, with a desperate grasp, a death clutch, he caught one arm of the grapnel, holding fast as the shock came. He was carried clear of the tree and partly submerged in the water as his added weight brought the flying machine so much lower. "Up! Up, Uncle Phaeton!" fairly howled Waldo, at the same time tugging at the now taut rope in which he was ably seconded by his brother. "For love of higher, uncle!" Then the noble machine responded to the touch of its builder, lifting the dripping stranger clear of the whirling currents, swinging him towards yonder higher level, where a fall would not prove so quickly fatal. And then the eager professor gave a shrill cheer as he saw the man, by a vigorous effort, draw his body upward sufficiently far to throw one leg over an arm of the grapnel itself. Knowing now that the rescued was in no especial peril, uncle Phaeton left the air ship to steer itself long enough for his nimble hands to take several turns of the drag rope around the cleat provided for that express purpose, thus relieving both Bruno and Waldo of the heavy strain which might soon begin to tell upon them. "Hurrah for we, us, and company!" cried Waldo, relieving his lungs of a portion of their pent-up energy, then leaning perilously far over the edge of the machine to encourage the queer fish he had hooked. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10. Rescued and Rescuers of the Lost City. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lost City by Joseph E. Badger, Jr. Chapter 10. Rescued and Rescuers. Despite their very natural excitement caused by this peril and its foiling, Professor Featherwit retained nearly all his customary coolness and presence of mind. Readily realizing that after such a grim ordeal would almost certainly come a powerful revulsion, his first aim was to swing the stranger far enough away from the whirlpool to give him a fair chance for life, in case he should fall, through dizziness or physical collapse, from the end of the drag rope. This took but a few seconds, comparatively speaking, though doubtless each moment seemed an age to the rescued stranger. Then the professor slowed his ship, looking around in order to determine upon the wisest route to take. For one thing, it would be severe work to draw the stranger bodily up and into the aerostat. For another, unless he should grow weak or suffer from vertigo, both time and labor would be saved by taking him direct to the shore of this broad lake. As soon as the rope was made fast and the strain taken off their muscles as well as their minds, Bruno flashed a look around, naturally turning his eyes in the direction of the whirlpool. Although less than a couple of minutes had elapsed since the man was lifted off the circling drift, even thus quickly had the end drawn nigh, for, even as he looked that way, Gillespie saw the great trunk sucked into the hidden sink, the top rising with a shiver clear out of the water as the butt lowered, a hollow rumbling sound coming to all ears as "Gone!" cried Bruno in awed tones as the whole drift vanished from sight forever. "Sucked in by Jonah's whale for ducats!" screamed Waldo, excitedly. "Fetch on your blessed sour-us of both the male and female sect! Trot 'em to the fore, and if my little old suck don't take the starch out of their backbones, they did have backbones, didn't they, uncle Phaeton?" Professor Featherwit frowned and shook his head in silent reproof. More nearly, perhaps, than either of the boys, he realized what an awful peril the stranger had so narrowly escaped. It was far too early to turn that escape into jest, even for one naturally light of heart. He leaned over the handrail, peering downward. He could see the rescued man sitting firmly in the bend of the grapnel, one hand tightly gripping the rope, its mate shading his eyes as he stared fixedly towards the whirling death pool, from whose jaws he had so miraculously been plucked. There was naught of debility, either of body or of mind, to be read in that figure, and with his fears on that particular point set at rest, for the time being, Professor Featherwit called out distinctly: "Is it all well with you, my good friend? Can you hold fast until the shore is reached, think?" "Heaven bless you, yes!" came the reply in half-choked tones. "If I fail in giving thanks—" "Never mention it, friend, it cost us nothing," cheerily interrupted the professor, then adding, "Hold fast, please, and we'll put on a wee bit more steam." The flying machine was now fairly headed for a strip of shore which offered an excellent opportunity for making a safe landing, and as that accelerated motion did not appear to materially affect the stranger, it took but a few minutes to clear the lake. "Stand ready to let go when we come low enough, please," warned the professor, deftly managing his pet machine for that purpose. The stranger easily landed, then watched the flying machine with painfully eager gaze, hands clasped almost as though in prayer. A more remarkable sight than this half-naked shape, burned brown by the sun, poorly protected by light skins, with sinew fastenings, could scarcely be imagined, and there was something close akin to tears in more eyes than one when he came running in chase, arms outstretched and voice wildly appealing. "Oh, come back! Take me! Don't leave me! For love of God and humanity, don't leave me to this living death!" Professor Featherwit called back a hasty assurance, and brought the air-ship to a landing with greater haste than was exactly prudent, all things considered, but who could keep cool blood and unmoved heart with yonder piteous object before their eyes? When he saw that the flying machine had fairly landed, and beheld its inmates stepping forth upon the sands with friendly salutations, the rescued stranger staggered, hands clasping his temples for a moment of drunken reeling, then he fell forward like one smitten by the hand of sudden death. Professor Featherwit called out a few curt directions, which were promptly obeyed by his nephews, and after a few minutes' well-directed work consciousness was restored, and the stranger feebly strove to give them thanks. In vain these were set aside. He seemed like one half insane from joy, and none who saw and heard could think that all this emotion arose from the simple rescue from the whirlpool. Nor did it. Wildly, far from coherently, the poor fellow spoke, yet something of the awful truth was to be gleaned even from those broken, disjointed sentences. For 10 years an exile in these horrible wilds. For 10 years not a single glimpse of white face or figure. For 10 ages no intelligible voice, save his own, and that, through long disuse, had threatened to desert him. 10 years? Echoed Waldo in amazement. "Why didn't you rack out of this then? I know I would, even if the woods were full of sourums and the like o' that. Yes, sir!" A low husky laugh came through those heavily bearded lips, and the stranger flung out his hands in a sweeping gesture, sunken eyes glowing with an almost savage light, as he spoke with more coherence. "Why is it, young gentleman? Why did I not leave, do you ask? Look! All about you it stretches a cell, a death cell from which escape is impossible. Here I have fought for what is ever more precious than bare life, for liberty, but though 10 awful years have rolled by, Here I remain, in worse than prison. Escape? Ah, how often have I attempted to escape, only to fail, because escape from these wilds is beyond the power of any person not gifted with wings." 10 years, you say, good friend? And all that time you have lived here alone? Asked the professor, curiously. 10 years? 10,000 years, I could almost swear, only for keeping the record so carefully, so religiously. And, pitiful Lord, how gladly would I have given my good right arm just for one faraway glimpse of civilization. How often But I am wearying you, gentlemen, and you may pray don't think that I am crazy. You will not. Both the professor and Bruno assured him to the contrary, but Waldo was less affected, and his curiosity could no longer be kept within bounds. Gently tapping one hairy arm, he spoke. "I say, friend, what were you doing out yonder in the big suck? Didn't you know the fun was hardly equal to the risk, sir?" "Easy, lad," reproved the professor, but with a smile which strangely softened the haggard, weather-worn visage. The stranger spoke. "Nay, kind sir, do not check the young gentleman. If you could only realize how sweet it is to my poor ears, the sound of a friendly voice. For so many weary years I have never heard one word from human lips which I could understand or make answer to. And now, what is it you wish to know, my dear boy?" "Well, since you've lived here so long, surely you hadn't ought to get caught in such a nasty pickle, unless it was through accident." "It was purely accidental, one that would have cost me dearly had not you come to my aid so opportunely. And yet, only for one thing, I could scarcely have regretted vanishing forever down that suck." His voice choked, his head bowed, his hands came together in a nervous grip, all betokening unusual agitation. Even Waldo was just a bit awed, and the stranger was first to break that silence with words. "How did the mishap come about, is it, young gentleman?" he said, a wan smile creeping into his face and relaxing those tensely drawn muscles once more. "While I was trying to replenish my stock of provisions, and after this fashion, good friends. I was fishing from a small canoe, and as the bait was not taken well, I must have fallen into a daydream, thinking of no matter now. And during that dreaming, the breeze must have blown me well out into the lake, for when I was roused up by a sharp jerk at my line, I found myself near its middle, without knowing just how I came there. I have no idea what sort of fish had taken my bait. There are many enormous ones in the lake, but it proved far too powerful for me to manage, and dragged the canoe swiftly through the water, heading directly for the outlet yonder." "Why didn't you let it go free, then?" "The line was fastened to the prow, and I could not loosen it in time. I drew my knife, one of flint, but keen enough to serve, only to have it jerked out of my hand and into the water. Then just as the fish must have plunged into the suck, I abandoned my canoe, jumping overboard." "That's just what I was wondering about," declared Waldo, with a vigorous nod of his head. "Yet we found you there." "Because I am a wretchedly poor swimmer. I managed to reach a drift which had not yet fairly entered the whirl, but I could do nothing more towards saving myself. Then you can guess the rest, gentlemen." "And the canoe?" demanded Waldo, content only when all points were made manifest. "I saw it drag down the centre of the suck," with an involuntary shiver. "The fish must have plunged into the underground river, whether willingly or not I can only surmise. But all the while I was drifting yonder, around and around with each circuit, drawing closer to the awful end, I could not help picturing to myself how the canoe must have plunged down, and brrr!" A shuddering shiver, which was more eloquent than words, but Waldo was not yet wholly content, finding an absorbing interest in that particular subject. "You call it a river? How do you know it's a river?" "Of course, I can only guess at the facts, my dear boy," the stranger made reply, smiling once more, and with an almost timid gesture, extending one hairy paw to lightly touch and gently stroke the arm nearest him.
Bruno turned away abruptly, for that gesture, so simple in itself, yet so full of pathos to one who bore in mind those long years of solitary exile, brought a moisture to his big brown eyes of which, boylike, he felt ashamed. Professor Featherwit likewise took note, and with greater presence of mind came to the rescue, lightly resting a hand upon the stranger's half bare shoulder while addressing his words to the youngster. A tremulous sigh escaped those bearded lips, and their owner drew closer to the wiry little aeronaut, plainly drawing great comfort from that mere contact. And with like ease uncle Phaeton lifted one of those hairy arms to rest it over his own shoulders, speaking briskly the while. "There is only one way of demonstrating the truth more clearly, my youthful inquisitor, and that is by sending you on a voyage of exploration. Are you willing to make the attempt, Waldo?"
"Not this evening. Some other evening, maybe," drawing back a bit, with a shake of his curly pate to match. "But I say, uncle Phaeton."
"Allow me to complete my say first, dear boy," with a bland smile. "That is easily done, though, for it merely consists of this: yonder sink or whirlpool is certainly the method this lake has of relieving itself of all surplus water. Everything points to a subterranean river which connects this lake with the Pacific Ocean."
"Wonder how long I'd have to hold my breath to make the trip?"
End of chapter 10.